Welcome everyone to Rebel Impact for another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Rebel Gray, and today we're going to talk about the commons and uncommon blue cards from the Spirit of Rebellion set. Alright, so you're sitting there thinking, what is this, summer 2017? Nope, it's definitely winter 2018, and whether you like it or not, Spirit of Rebellion is still relevant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's still legal in the standard format, which includes all of the Awakenings block and all of the Legacies block. Second, it's still going to see a fair bit of play in draft. And now that drafting is a thing, we are bound to get some new players coming into the game, and they're going to need a way to evaluate cards for the constructed and the limited formats. And I'm going to mostly leave the limited format stuff to my fellow content creators, but I will talk a little bit about it here. And, you know, I guess the third reason is that I kind of felt it was probably about the right time to start finishing up the videos in this series on the non-dice cards from the previous block. And I say previous because Legacies is hitting stores this week. In fact, some stores are having a midnight release right now, or, you know, in a couple hours, I guess. So we've all got new cards to look forward to, and I feel like I'd be remiss in my duties as a content creator if I didn't remind you that you still want to know about these old cards and how useful they all really are. All right, well, let's get right to it after this. Now, I know this die says worthwhile supports on it, and actually there's only 3 blue supports in the entire Spirit of Rebellion set, and it's 2 I'm going to talk about and a third one which I'm not going to talk about, which is Your Eyes Can Deceive You. And I'm not going to cover it because, quite frankly, it's pretty bad. But the 2 that are worth discussing are really good, or can be good in constructed, and maybe even have some decent use in draft. The first one is Dark Presence, and it's a card that has seen some play in the past for its ability to work well in discard or mill decks on the villain side of things. And I've spoken about it at length in other videos, and I really feel it is probably one of the most powerful permanent removal cards in the game. Permanent meaning that it stays on the table and can be reused every round. The only argument against it is that when it's used, the opponent chooses the die that actually gets removed. And personally, I don't mind that, since it still gets rid of a die regardless. The problem with the card as it is written is that it procs off a discard side being rolled, and that can mean a reroll, mind you. So its effectiveness then is only limited by the amount of potential discard sides you can bring into play. Unfortunately, there's no villain character that has more than one discard side on its die. Voss only has one side, Dooku only has one side, even Tarkin as a legendary from the new Legacy set only has one discard side. So no matter what, unless you're bringing in a support die like Interrogation Droid, which has multiple discard sides, your chances to use the support are going to be limited to about 1 in 6, or exactly 1 in 6, in individual die rolls. So it's for those reasons that Dark Presence probably doesn't get the love that it deserves. However, as we see a new block of cards grow and shape the game, and this card remains in standard for a little while, it's worth keeping this one in the back of your mind in the event that you start seeing some characters with 2 discard sides on their die. Dark Presence could shine as a crucial control piece in a deck with those sorts of characters. The second card worth talking about is less impressive by my standards, but still a card that sees some play here and there, and it's Meditate. We saw this card early on in the SOR meta, mostly in the Emo Kids deck, which was Kylo 1 and Darth Vader Dark Apprentice. The idea was to bring some consistency to the deck by sacrificing like a Sith Holocron die or another blank into Vader's 3 damage special, or maybe even Kylo's special if you know for a fact that they're holding onto a big vehicle like against a Pomaz deck, which was very prevalent at the time. Functionally, this card, it still works great for bringing consistency, and I even saw it around a little bit in the Empire at War meta. The biggest issue with it is one of 2 things, depending on the type of player that you are. Your reasoning for not including it might be that it's too slow. It takes a whole action to remove your die, turn it to a non-damage side. Then you have to resolve that die in a following action. Another reasoning could be that it only turns a die to a non-damage side, which means that it's not really for aggro and it's only meant for shields or focus or disrupt or specials. And you know what? That still gives it a lot of utility though, doesn't it? I mean, the blank doesn't have to be a character die or anything specific like that. So personally, I think in this world of special chaining with R2-P2 decks and the upcoming Yoda meta, Meditate might still have a spot somewhere. The question is whether it will remain as it is now and be on a card that's just kind of on the cusp of making a 30 card cut, or if it will finally be good enough to include in those special chaining decks, because even its slow nature can be overcome with special chaining, which usually sweeps 2, 3, even 4 dice off the table in a single action. So just like with supports, there's actually only 3 upgrades in the entire set. There's one that is villain, one that's hero, and one that's neutral. And here I've excluded the one villain upgrade that is called Now I Am the Master, because it's just kind of, well, it's pretty bad. And in fact, the hero upgrade that I'm going to talk to you about is one that I kind of think is underrated to a high degree. And not just because I've been using this card for the past 3 months, but because I think that it is really good as part of a stall game for even the currently competitive decks now that shields kind of matter. So the card I'm talking about is Protective Mentor, and it's probably a very misunderstood card. Its text is very straightforward. Attached character shields can be used to block damage dealt to any character. The first bit I think is interesting because it says any character, and it would be kind of funny using it to prevent Dr. Afro from drawing a card when BT1 deals indirect damage to herself. But in the real world, what this card does is allows you to draw attention away from the character that your opponent really wants to kill. On top of that, it also lets you absorb up to any amount of damage as it has the word can in it. So let's give a modern example of how this card might work in the shell of a Qui-Gon Kanan deck. For many opponents, Qui-Gon is the primary target, but man, he's very hard to kill. Generally, they don't go for him unless he's being upgraded, right? Now, let's say your opponent decides to go after Qui-Gon and Qui-Gon has 2 shields, and you're thinking, I really want to keep that 1 shield on him for his ability. Your Kanan, maybe he's got 3 shields, and he's also got, let's say, Protective Mentor. Your opponent sends 4 damage towards your Qui-Gon. You can choose to block 3 with Kanan's shield because he's got Protective Mentor, take the 4th damage onto Qui-Gon's shields, and the outcome without Mentor is that Qui-Gon takes 2 damage, and he's also again got no shields, right? Imagine having one of these on each Qui-Gon and Kanan, and you're producing 5 shields per turn or so. So that gets out of hand really quickly, and also is very annoying for your opponent, because the ability to manipulate damage placement in that scenario is very, very high. Obviously, almost none of this really matters with indirect damage coming into play, but with this block, you can deal with straight up ranged or melee damage, and I think that's pretty darn good, because essentially what Protective Mentor can help you craft is a better board state in a shield meta. For whatever reason, you know, I don't know why it's not getting the attention that I think it deserves, but maybe some people just don't like it, or it's very hard to include it in your deck, which is a really good argument for Blue Hero right now. It's such a tight deck that every card in it needs to really be a power card, and this is kind of not a power card. It's more of a control tempo kind of card, and works kind of just better in a mill shell, I guess. The second card I'm going to talk about, and the last one in this section, is Force Illusion. And it, unlike Protective Mentor, is an amazing card that definitely gets the attention that it does deserve, because in an aggro-heavy meta like the one we have now, this card is super powerful. It's such a simple card, too. It allows you to essentially block all of one source of damage as cards off your deck rather than applying them as damage tokens. That's fantastic, as it lets you use your deck to extend the hit points of one of your crucial characters. That can literally win you a game. It's also really annoying to your opponent. The upsides are pretty clear for this one resource costing game extending card. It can force your opponent to send additional damage to your Force Illusion character to ensure the kill, which is very manipulative for you as a player to be able to do, right? Maybe you've got 3 damage left on a character of yours, and they've got 6 damage showing as 3, and then a plus 1, and 2, and like maybe like a 1 and a +1. And the 1 and the +1 can't kill them, right? They can either manipulate the way damage is on the table by moving around their pluses, or you're going to make them use more damage than maybe they want, or they're going to have to send it all in 2 different waves in order to defeat that character. So it really draws a lot of attention down to your characters. And the other thing I want to mention that doesn't really get talked a lot with Force Illusion, because, again, we're in an aggro versus aggro meta for the most part, is that the downsides in this card are really not to be underestimated. Force Illusion shines in a hyper aggro deck that wants to beat down faster than it can lose, okay? Villain 5-die, for example, takes wonderful advantage of this card by just extending Bala's health by, however many cards you're willing to discard. But it needs to be used with caution. And I'm not talking about the card, which we're going to be covering in a little bit. I mean the mindset of caution. Milling 4 or 5 cards in your deck can be very detrimental. Force Illusion might mill the best cards from your deck. It might mill the other copy of Force Illusion, okay? Or anything that maybe you have as a 1-of in your deck that you feel like is in there for a good reason and that you really want to draw. And that can be very hurtful to you. I've had it happen to me. It's a very dissatisfying feeling to be like, oh, well, we're going to play another round, but I kind of just discarded a bunch of cards that were kind of going to help me win next round. Maybe I even got rid of my whole next hand of cards, and I'm like, ouch, that really sucks. And that's the risk you take with it. Thankfully, it's not very useful against mill decks, but against hybrid decks, it certainly could be. In any case, Force Illusion is probably the best 1-of card in the entire game. As long as you're running blue somewhere in your deck, you're likely including a copy of this card in it as sort of an oh shit button. And you can just plop it down, take lethal damage to clear the board with some dice, maybe even some extra dice. It's a totally awesome card, and you should put it in your deck, even in draft. All right, we're heading back over to this screen for a little bit, and we're going to talk about the blue villain events that are worth talking about in the Spirit of Rebellion set. And the first one is Anger. Anger is a great card that has sort of fallen out of favor for the time being. It can only be played if you've got blanks on 2 or more of your dice, but for 0 cost, it lets you resolve an opponent's die showing damage, so it becomes your damage. And so the construction of this card, the layout of this card, works superbly in a deck that has enough blanks to make it worthwhile every now and then. So cards like Dark Council, cards like Sith Holocron, or even Chance Cube. But since you can't really rely on getting blanks all the time, and you really don't want to roll them anyway, a lot of times this card seems to get relegated to a 1-of in a lot of decks. But you know what? It's still great for 0, and as we see more double blanks cards for Villain Blue, this card might become a 2-of because it is such an interesting little swing card, Nothing really comes close to what it does for the cost and the setup board state that it requires, which really isn't that crazy when you think about it. I mean, imagine Reversal. Reversal on the hero side is a decent card. Even Double Cross is a decent card. They require you to either remove a die, pay 2, pay 3 resources. They cost a lot more than Anger. So this card still gets some talk and some attention because for its cost, it's just pretty darn good. The second one here is Lightsaber Throw, and what you got to know about Lightsaber Throw is that it is one of the best damage out of hand cards for villain, period. It's kind of like Force Strike, but it's different because Force Strike flips a die into a melee side and then resolves that die. Lightsaber Throw, on the other hand, lets you double dip on a die for the cost of a resource. So if you've got a 2 melee or a 1 melee die showing, you can do 2 damage for $1. And then also later resolve that die for its own damage. So it's become a Villain Blue staple because of its low cost and also the high chance to play it for its effect. Because you're going to have melee dice showing on your blue villain deck at some point. So you can almost think of it like having another 2 melee die on the table for 1 resource as long as another melee die is showing at any given time in the game when this card is in your hand. It's really hard to pass up. So you're going to want to put this card in your deck. And even in draft, it's probably got a lot of value. I mean, anything that does damage out of hand that for really cheap, that you don't see coming all the time, or that, it's just freaking good. And Lightsaber Throw is one of those cards that with Force Strike in your deck, it just continuously makes damage. It adds consistency to your deck. It increases your damage curve. It's absolutely amazing. The last card we're going to talk about in this little set here, and this is actually the first set of villain cards we're talking about. We're going to talk about 3 more, is Manipulate. And this is still a fairly staple villain blue control card. It is a soft removal that just works super well. So you can look at it like, how can I use this card to maximum advantage? Well, you turn a die to a blank. Maybe you've already have a die that has a blank. Let's say one of those Sith Holocrons. Well, Sith Holocron has 2 blanks on it. So you can turn that Sith Holocron to its other blank side and then turn an opponent's die to blank. So you've not really changed your board state at all, but you've managed to change their board state. And maybe you've gotten rid of their 3 range damage die that's sitting on the table, or 2 melee damage die, or maybe they were going to disrupt you next turn. You've gotten rid of that die now. So, or you've not gotten rid of it, but you've flipped it to a blank. So now you're going to force it maybe into re-rolling or using a focus die on that particular die or something like that. And because it allows you to essentially produce a blank at will, it can be used in tangent with the first card that we talked about, which is Anger. And that gives it some additionally great value. So a lot of times you see Anger and Manipulate in the same kind of decks. Tarkin decks may also see this card as an auto-include in standard format, because perhaps you roll 1 blank with Tarkin on one of his die or some die on the table. You can manipulate a second die, turn both of those die with his power action into 4 indirect damage. So I see this card continuing to have legs, continuing to see play, because at 0 cost, these are cards you look at and you say, is this still relevant? Is this still good? Is this still a card I want in my deck? And the answer for Manipulate is yes, yes, yes. All right, we've got 3 more villain events to talk about. And the first one is No Disintegrations. And what you got to know about No Disintegrations is that it is a pretty good mill card. And it's worth including blue characters in your villain mill deck just to be able to play this card, as having 2 copies lets you mill 4 cards together, or you could pitch the first one to reroll because maybe it's not worth it for you to mill 1 for 1 and play the second one for the full effect of 3. Then maybe you cheat that one back and you get to play it again. So you could actually mill 6 cards by only playing the second copy twice. And milling 3 cards for 1 resource, that is just too good to pass up when you think about it. I mean, you would do 3 damage for a resource on basically any die if you could, right? You would do 3 damage for free, but if you could with Vader's die. But that's kind of how Mill looks at things, right? It looks at your deck as damage you have to deal. And in this case, you're dealing 3 deck damage for $1 on the second play, which is so, so good. And it will continue to see play, as Villain Mill didn't really learn to mill faster in the new set necessarily. And this is still a way cheaper option than any other option currently on the villain side. And on top of that, villain tends to mill a little bit better from the hand as far as, discarding. They actually have a bunch of 2 discard sides in their decks, on their die sides. Jabba, Tarkin, they have 2 discard sides. But you don't see too much stuff straight from the deck. So this gives you some in-deck options to mill stuff from their deck. And that's why it's so, so good. Second card here is also really good. But when we first saw this card, people weren't the craziest about it, because we were coming out of an Awakenings meta where we were looking at cards that cost 5, like Millennium Falcon, and we were like, we're never going to be able to play that. That's crazy. But Spirit of Rebellion changed a lot of stuff, okay? And since that time, we have seen Rise Again become a key part of the strategy of Palpatine decks, and even some other blue decks that might run it as a one-of for the blue upgrade attachment. The bang for your buck on this card, it's awesome. You'd still want to heal 5 for 5 resources if you could as a villain player, and the added effect is just kind of like the cherry on top. It lets you drop a card, let's say from your hand at the end of the previous round, if you know that you're going to be able to play Rise Again next round. So you can draw that extra card and then be like, well, I put my Force Lightning in the discard pile. It was my last card in my hand, so instead of drawing 4, now I can draw, or I've got the Rise Again. Instead of drawing, 3 cards, now I can draw 4. That's really great. It's easy to see it coming also, because people who get to 5 resources in unique blue villain decks, especially with that Palpatine deck, you know it's going to happen. It's a telegraph kind of play. But this card is really where it's at, and it just fits the theme so perfectly. The Price of Failure is the last blue villain event we're going to talk about, and it's such a great card, although people were recently spooked by coercion more so than they ought to have been, because they really thought, man, I'm not gonna run this card anymore because someone's gonna coercion it out of my hand and they're gonna force me to kill off one of my characters, and if it's my last character and it's a blue character, then it's really gonna suck and I'm gonna lose the game. But the Price of Failure is a card that continues to wait to be at the core of an explosive deck. It did see some additional play in the EAW meta with Magna Guards around, and not because Magna Guard can withstand its effect. It can't, because this card doesn't kill. This card kills instantly and not by damage, so your Magna Guard will die instantly if you Price Failure it. But it was used on Magna Guard because it essentially lets you get mileage out of the Magna Guard's inevitable death anyway, right? It's kind of like a leadership for free at that point. If you know Magna's already got, not 9 damage on him or 8 damage, whatever, you can Price of Failure him. And then now he turned into a resource and lets you reactivate another character, which is great. And it still costs 0. So for sacrificing a character that would otherwise be targeted for death for literally no cost, there's no reason that this card really should not see more play, because it's got a huge potential for swing plays. It's just that it needs to find the right deck to work ideally. This really is a card that is so explosive, and I can't believe that it doesn't see more play right now than it is, because I wouldn't call it a sleeper, because it's been around and around. It just never really seems to make it into a tier 1 deck or have the legs that it needs. And I'm not exactly sure why, but as we go into the Legacies block, this card may see some more play. I have a strong feeling. All right, let's move on to the hero events in SOR. And the first one that is totally worth talking about is Caution. With very little doubt, Caution is the best shield generating card in the game. No other card gives you 3 shields for 0 resources, period. Yes, you have to give up a character die, but it can be any character die, any side, so you can plan ahead strategically, like heroes are supposed to do. It's absolutely become an auto-include 2 of in any blue deck, and will be until this card cycles out of standard. In draft, this thing also rocks. I mean, you think about 3 shields, it's 3 extra hit points when in a very low dice format, and that counts. That can be a big, big win in anyone's book. It's simply an amazing card, and it's just another one of the reasons that Spirit of Rebellion is such a strong, over-the-curve kind of set. Now, the second card, again, people have had differing opinions about this one, but if you ask me, it's not a great card. But if you dabble in blue hero whatsoever, you need to be aware of its presence. And I say that it's not great because, like a lot of hero cards, and you're going to see it in all 3 of these cards that we're going to show you, it takes at least 1 die to use. And it's usually 1 big die, like a mace die. The advantage is it lets you set up for next round, but you're giving up a die, and that puts you behind in damage or resources right now. It's such a frustrating design, to say the least, but it can be a very good card, and one in which certain players still really like a lot. So, I mean, you do see this card played in mace decks. I mean, that's kind of primarily where it is, because you can snag away a 4 if they've disrupted your resources or you can't pay for it, in order to bring out a lightsaber for essentially free, right, at the cost of giving up damage that maybe you would not otherwise have been able to actually spend or afford. That's the word I'm looking for. Afford. I don't see the appeal of it, but hey, you know what? I don't play blue hero a lot like I used to. I feel like this card is currently out of favor in the meta, and it's unlikely to ever return, because if people didn't run it super consistently with mace, and if that's the only deck that it works in, I kind of feel like that's not good enough. There needs to be something else that catapults this card above the curve, and it really kind of, I don't see it ever getting there. However, Guard is another auto include in hero decks, much like Caution. So in this scenario, despite giving up a die this time, you're also taking away more than just 2 damage that you might be giving up for this, right? In most cases, you most likely are giving up exactly a 2 melee die to remove any 2 of your opponent's dice, which you get to choose. It's almost like a better he doesn't like you for blue hero. It's a very clutch card for ditching really big modifiers too if you want, like Ancient Lightsaber has a +3 on it, and sacrificing that to guard 3 dice away can mean a really big swing for you not taking damage this turn or disrupting your opponent's board state in a pretty huge way. I think it's going to continue to see play. There's also a really nice promo of this card, which is worth picking up for cheap. I think I have a few on sale on my Facebook Marketplace post, if I'm not mistaken. And you're going to want to get at least 2 of these, since you're going to get a ton of mileage out of them. It's one of the best removals in the game for blue hero. In fact, it's one of the few. Sometimes people even look at Caution as a blue removal card, because it's essentially like, hey, remove a die to remove 3 damage in the future. You know, it's kind of an investment. But Guard, it's going to be here a while. And I feel like it's one of those cards that probably should be reprinted in the following block, because it's just perfect for what blue hero wants to do, right? It's giving up some damage to really make a big save you play. And that to me is the most, it doesn't get any more thematic than that. All right, here's the last 2 events that we're going to go over. And the first one on the left here is My Ally is the Force. And this is another really great, powerful card to come out of this set, but it's also very niche. So one of the best changes they ever made was to change focus to turn any die to a side instead of any other die. And what it allows you to do is to play this card on a focus die and use the focus on that die to turn itself into whatever it wants. Then, you know, use the ambush to resolve that die. So this is best used on a 2 focus side die like Obi-Wan Kenobi or maybe the new Yoda. And the thing is that it costs 2, and that's kind of prohibitively high for an event that has a very variable impact, but it's understandable when you consider what can be done with it in the situation of 2 focus. And you know what? It still only works on blue dice, and that's very limiting as well. But it's important that you're aware of this card's existence, just like with Destiny, because it can actually be a win con for some people. And I've seen decks that have been built around My Ally of the Force, and it's really tough to build around it, but you can do it, and I don't think it's very wise. On the bright side, I still think it actually brings an element of surprise to this game at times, which I actually really love a lot. So My Ally of the Force gets kind of an honorable mention here. Synchronicity, on the other hand, not to be underestimated. It's probably the best blue common in the entire set. And this is the only hero-based damage from hand available that does 2. And if I'm not mistaken, that is. And it's unblockable damage. And it comes at the cost of 0. So here's another reason SOR is so incredibly powerful. Because this card should cost 1, right? But because it has a play requirement requiring you to have dice showing melee and shields, it got its cost dropped to 0, and it does 2 unblockable damage. So even though it's conditional, it's super thematic, and it's guaranteeing that you're going to play this card at some point in your blue hero deck, because you're going to have shields, you're going to have melee showing. Qui-Gon decks love this card. Even Ahsoka decks can play this card pretty well. It's cheap also. Pick up 2 if you don't have them. It's best to construct it. But hey, in draft it could be pretty good too, right? Anakin and Lobot can actually meet the requirements together in draft too, so keep that in mind. Last but not least, we've got neutral events from blue in Spirit Rebellion. And the first one up is Overconfidence. Overconfidence is still considered one of the best removal options to put in blue villain decks. Heroes have a guard, and that's still somewhat better, but you will see Overconfidence in hero decks alongside of it, which are mostly running blue, or maybe they're all blue, because remember, you are going to need 6 to 8 removal cards in your deck generally overall anyway for constructed, so you're going to need more options. And as long as you've got a blue character that can stay alive, Overconfidence is pretty good. I think it's great too, because it's both a soft removal and a hard removal combined together, and there's really no other card that does that. So, and also, it's a very thinky removal card. You have to look at the dice that you're going to be having rerolled to make sure that you're making good choices. It's not always as simple a choice as like, oh, this has 50% damage side, that has 33% damage side, so let's reroll both of those and see what happens, because what you're actually talking about here and referencing is values. And so you want to look at value versus on two dice, right? You want to look at things like expected value or average die rolls to ensure that you make a very smart play with overconfidence, because you can really screw this one up. And you're re-rolling die anyway, so all the math you do in the world could just be, hey, luck turns up and you actually made their die that had the 1 on it into a 3. And what are you going to do about it? That's destiny, right? But for one resource, I think it still manages to be one of the better removal cards for blue in the entire game. And the fact that it's neutral, it's just kind of a cherry on top there. All right, the last card here is Premonitions, and the biggest downside to Premonitions is that if you include 1 in your deck, you have to include 2 in your deck because of the way that it works. And it was part of that sort of Destiny, the card, like concept that Lucas tried to bring into Blue Hero and SOR to provide discounts for really big cards. The thing was, there weren't any really expensive hero cards within Blue that made this card necessary. On the villain side, however, they had Rise Again, and that's kind of where it saw some play. Outside of Blue, it saw some decent use at the start of the SOR meta as people were kind of trying it out with different things like launch bays or big vehicles, things that were costing 4 and 5 to get out, that it still really wasn't that feasible to actually put on the board, right? Not until EAW came around. Sadly, it's 2 deck slots that you're committed to, and it puts 1 card in limbo while you seek out the second copy of Premonitions. It can't really be part of a core deck strategy because that second copy could be buried near the bottom of your deck or at the very bottom of your deck. So there's things like mill decks, which make this card relatively unplayable. And since you can't search for events in any way, shape, or form in Destiny, that's also kind of a problem. But again, I think it's worth knowing about it. If you think there's a deck in the future that can make good use of it on either the hero or the villain side, so far villain seems to be the side that kind of cares about it more. But I've seen it really outside of, I've seen it in more rainbow or multicolors type stuff in hero. But in general, the card's not really highly favored anymore because we can actually pay for things now. We can get things out. We've got cards like Truce. You know, smuggling sees some play. But outside of that, you know, we can pay for things. It's not a big deal. So Premonitions, unfortunately, not a great card. But again, worth knowing about just for your knowledge. Now, as I was putting together this video, I realized there are really a lot of cards to talk about in Blue in this set. And the reason for that is that Spirit of Rebellion was very kind to Blue. And on top of that, a lot of these cards are over the expected curve, especially with what we saw from Awakenings. Stuff like Force Strike is insanely good from that set. And cards like Lightsaber Throw and Synchronicity really took it a step further to make the game faster, give decks higher damage potential, and give Blue an edge that it's so needed at that time. Or at least we think it needed, right? And I could go on and on about the SOR set because it's actually the first set that I purchased into for my collection. There's an unbelievable amount of amazing cards in it, and I'm really glad that we could talk about it today, to highlight that for you guys who are just coming into the game and that maybe are, you know, going to be playing some draft coming up, because a lot of these cards are really excellent choices in draft. Some of them are not good choices, like Premonition is a terrible choice, but some of them are pretty good, and they synergize really well within their color, and in some cases outside of their color. And anything that can work well in all colors is going to be really good for draft, because draft is kind of becoming this rainbow format very, very quickly, right? So keep that in mind as you're looking through cards and evaluating cards. And take a look at some of the past videos in this series that I did on Red Awakenings card, Yellow Awakenings cards, and that stuff. And I'm going to be finishing out the SOR cards, then doing the EAW 3 colors there. And then I'm going to do all the gray cards across the entire block of Awakenings, sort of all as one. And then sooner or later, I'm going to get to Legacies, maybe like, you know, sometime in February. All right, folks, that's pretty much all I had to say about cards. I want to thank all of those wonderful patrons who have donated to my Patreon. I cannot emphasize enough that you blow my mind when you donate money to me for something that I enjoy doing. And if you're watching this and you want to donate to, feel free to hit the link for my Patreon below or go to patreon.com/rebelgray. But a subscription to this channel would be super awesome. You can follow me on Facebook, on Twitter, all that good stuff. All that stuff's in the link below in the notes. All right, so I think I've gone on long enough with this one. I'll see you next time here at Rebel Impact for another tactical video on Star Wars Destiny, maybe in a week or so. And until then, remember that Gondarks don't actually like to have their ears pulled, and that cosplay is not consent. May the Force be with you.